Dengue cases may be on the rise again as the peak season of June to October begins. 163 cases have been reported in the week ending the 10th of June. That's 52 more cases than in the previous week. However, this is a small number compared to recent years. Looking at last year's figures, the blue line, around this time it peaked at 1,567 dengue cases. In 2020, that's the yellow line, reported cases were rising around this time of the year, eventually peaking at 1,787.
The 163 weekly cases is not the highest so far this year. January saw as many as 280 cases. So what do these trends mean for this year's dengue season? Well, we're joined by Dr. Ashley St. John, Associate Professor at Duke-NUS Medical School. Professor, thanks so much for speaking with us. Now, I was trying to look very carefully at those numbers and those lines. We saw that the dengue numbers started to climb again after coming down from a high that was at the start of January, but still nowhere close to the peak that we've seen in the past years. Is that usual for you?
Well, in Singapore, we have dengue as an endemic virus. That means that we can expect to see dengue year-round, but usually we do see a peak between approximately June and October each year. So in some ways, we're right at the time of year when we do expect to see more dengue cases. And so in that sense, it's expected. But it is lower than it was last year or even earlier this year. And this is probably because dengue tends to have a multi-year cycle in Singapore, so that we see every 5 or 6 years a surge in cases. And then after that, for many years, the cases can be lower. And we saw a really high peak, beginning in 2020. With the change to dengue 3 being a very common serotype in dengue in Singapore. And since then, we expect that many people may have been exposed to dengue. And so possibly some of the immunity that we have in our community is keeping those numbers a little bit lower.
Dr. St. John, the trajectory of this year's line, it appears almost as flat as the 2021 line in purple that we saw in that diagram. What are the possible reasons for that?
So it's difficult to know all of the reasons, of course, but, as I mentioned, we tend to see these cycles. And when a new cycle occurs and we see a large epidemic of dengue, usually it's accompanied by a change in serotype. And for us recently, this was dengue 3, but for many decades, it went back and forth between dengue 1 and dengue 2. And so we think that probably the exposure levels, the fact that many people have come in contact with the virus, their antibodies may have been boosted against the virus, can keep it a little bit under control in subsequent years. That's just one theory of how some of these cycles could be working, but there could also be other factors.
So just to clarify, because it works in a cycle, we are still in a so-called safe zone, so to speak, or could it simply be some sort of calm before a storm?
So that's a good question. We always want to be able to predict the future, which is very difficult to do. But I think that we should always be vigilant for dengue. Dengue is something that is endemic here. It can quickly get out of control. So there's no real answer for what will happen, how we will predict the future. But certainly, the modeling would suggest that the levels of dengue being lower at this time are not truly unexpected, but that certainly we also can expect a rise in cases as we're right in that time of year when that often occurs here in Singapore. So certainly have to be vigilant.
We certainly do have to be vigilant, Dr. St. John, but the World Meteorological Organization has sounded the alert that on the probability of an El Nino phenomenon, at least until September. Is that going to create the possibility of a large-scale outbreak of mosquitoes this year, even though the current trend suggests otherwise?
So I should say that the weather and climate are a little bit out of my expertise, but in general, I know that there have been some studies done that seem to suggest that they have less of an effect than you might assume. Some of these other factors, possibly, like I mentioned, the immunity in the community, travel, and introduction of new strains of viruses, these are things that are really well understood to play a role, and we understand a little bit less about the weather. So, of course, it can be a contributing factor, but it doesn't seem to account for everything, and it can't seem to explain all of why these outbreaks occur.
Just a quick question on this other trend we're seeing of Zika cases, 19 reported in 2023, 15 of them in one cluster alone. Should we be concerned about this?
Well, I think Zika is a very concerning virus for a few reasons. Of course, we always have had sporadic cases. Every year, there are a few cases in Singapore. And in adults, Zika is a fairly mild disease. So the symptoms can be very similar to dengue, where you might have a febrile illness and a rash, some joint pain. Those are very common with Zika, and it's very similar to dengue. But actually, most adults don't seem to experience many symptoms. In fact, they're almost asymptomatic. And because it's so mild in adults, we don't detect it as quickly usually. And that combined with it looking a lot like dengue, someone might assume they have dengue and not be so concerned. So I think this is something we do need to keep an eye on. We need to make sure that we monitor Zika in the community because, of course, it puts women who are pregnant at risk of having fetal complications and things like that. So, of course, we are familiar with Zika. There have been cases every year, and this is still a manageable number of cases. It's something that we should definitely continue to monitor.
All right, a message received. Stay vigilant. Thank you, Dr. Ashley St. John from Duke-NUS Medical School.